Hello, marine biologists. This is the last section of the invertebrate zoology lecture. This is the portion that we were not able to complete in class. It's the phylum Echinodermata. The etymology of the word Echinodermata breaks down so you have echino, which means spiny, and derma refers to skin. So Echinodermata translates from Latin to spiny skin. And these include a number of organisms that you're probably familiar with, and maybe a few others that you are not so familiar with. So sea stars you've probably heard of, sea urchins possibly, but you probably have never heard of brittle stars or sea cucumbers or sea lilies. It turns out that all of these organisms are related to each other, and they share some very important features in common with each other. So, as we've done with all phyla up till this point, we're going to ask our basic questions. Number one, what kind of symmetry does this organism have? And this organism has a very unusual form of symmetry. And we refer to it as pentaradial symmetry. Penta means 5. Radial refers to the rays going around in a circle. And so it's a kind of radial symmetry, but it's 5-sided. So you're probably familiar with the sea star and the fact that our local sea stars usually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arms. And so that's where we get that 5-sided symmetry. But it turns out that all echinoderms have some degree of pentaradial symmetry. Also, these organisms are triploblastic and are true coelomates. So again, those are the 3 main things that we look at in the major body form of these organisms. And now we can move on to the unique features that they might have. So here are some unique features found in all echinoderms in general, and then what we're going to do is go down through each of the major echinoderm groups and look at how these are expressed within those groups. So number one, echinoderms generally have a calcareous endoskeleton of ossicles, and I know that sounds like a mouthful. Calcareous means that it has calcium carbonate in it, which is like a shelly material. Endoskeleton, endo means internal, skeleton, again referring to the skeletal elements of this organism. So this is an internal skeleton, similar to yours, except that they are made up of many tiny plates, or what we refer to as ossicles. In fact, the word ossicle in Latin means small bones. So there are, in some cases, thousands of very small calcium carbonate fragments that all kind of fit together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, the second feature here is that echinoderms possess a water vascular system. It's a very unusual internal flow system that they have in their body that is only found in echinoderms. There is no other group of animals that has a water vascular system. In the next slide, I will explain how this works. And the water vascular system is connected to a series of tube feet. These are hydraulically controlled tubes that essentially can be everted at the base of each of their arms, and this enables them to walk along the bottom, and it also allows them to hold on to and apply pressure to food. They particularly like to eat clams and mussels and things like that, and so when they apply these tube feet, they're able to pull those mussels apart and consume the mussels and clams inside of the shell of the prey item itself. It's actually pretty cool the way that works. Lastly, the echinoderms have these small features on the surface of the skin of the organism called pedicellariae. These are microscopic structures, so you can't see them with your naked eye. You'd have to actually look at them under a microscope. And they look like miniature crab claws, if you will. They look like little pinchers all along the surface. And what they do is they prevent this organism from having other things settling on top of them. Essentially, the pedicellariae act as a cleaning mechanism, keeping the surface of the echinoderm clean. Okay, let me jump to the water vascular system real quickly since it's so unique. I want to show you what it looks like. This is a sea star that has had the top of the organism removed so that you can see the canals down which the water vascular system runs. if you were able to remove the water vascular system and very carefully remove it out of the soft tissue of this organism, it would look like this. It's essentially a series of tubes, and it starts up here with a structure called a madreporite. It's like a sieve, or almost like a storm drain, if you will. So water is able to flood into this tube right here through this madreporite, and it fills these canals with seawater. And it has a muscle up there on the top of the madreporite, and when it flexes that muscle, it causes this to constrict. So once it's filled with seawater and this closes off, now the system can be pressurized by flexing muscles against it. It works on the same principle as the brake system in most people's cars. So you put your brake fluid in and you close the cap at the top of the where you put it in, and now the whole system is sealed so that when you press on your brakes, it actually causes these pads to compress and cause your tires to slow down. And so this operates in a very similar fashion. Muscles that flex in the arms against these enclosed tubes of seawater will actually cause the tube feet down here to evert. It's an amazing system. And here is the arm of a sea star who is everting those tube feet. And you'll notice they have little sucker discs at the base of them so that they can actually grab onto a surface and keep some suction against it. It's, again, a really amazing system that is only found in the echinoderms. Speaking of which, there are 5 major groups of echinoderms, and here are the names of them, the common names to them. In the middle here we have the sea stars. That's one major group, one major class, I should say. The second major class is this one right over here, the brittle stars. The brittle stars look like sea stars, but they move in a very different way, and there are some important differences in their anatomy, which we're not going to get into the details of in this class, although you can take my majors level animal diversity class if you want to learn more about the differences in these organisms. Number 3 would be the sea urchins. Sea urchins are also echinoderms, and it's not as apparent how you would find that 5-sided symmetry, that pentaradial symmetry here, but if you look straight down on the top of the organism, you actually can see it, and I'm going to show you some slides of that in just a second. Sand dollars actually fall into this group. They are, in fact, just flattened out sea urchins. The 4th group would be the sea cucumbers. In this organism, it looks almost like it's bilateral, right? It looks like it has a front end and a back end, and yet this organism also exhibits a kind of 5-sided symmetry. Essentially, if you take an animal like a sea star and you take the top of it and elongate the top up and then take the animal and lay it down on its side, now you're at a sea cucumber. So if you want to see that pentaradial symmetry in the sea cucumber, you have to hold it almost like a telescope and look down one end, and you will see the 5-sided symmetry in this fashion here. The last group of echinoderms are the sea lilies, and these are enigmatic, strange, very ancient echinoderms. We do have them here in Southern California, but only in extremely deep water. It's very unusual to see them here. Most places that you see them are in the tropics. So let's start first with the class Asteroidea. That's the scientific name, that's the class scientific name for the sea stars. And running down the length of the underside of the arm where the tube feet are coming out, that structure is referred to as the ambulacral groove. And they have one running down the length of each of their arms. Again, that's the groove from which the tube feet will emerge. So very interesting animals there. And this is what the animal looks like, again, with the surface removed. And there's a lot of organs here, and really all I want you to pay attention to is that water vascular system, which appears here in blue. So it's got this ring, this hollow ring that the seawater falls into, and then they extend down one of these 5 radial arms, each one heading down an arm in this fashion here. And all of the little, they look like turkey basters almost. These are also filled with seawater, and when the muscles flex against them and squeeze those balls, essentially it everts out the tube feet. This image right here is actually the cross-section of a starfish arm, And you can see the ambulacral groove running right down the middle right here. And out from underneath it is where you have the tube feet emerging. Okay, the second group, the class Ophiuroidea. I know that sounds like a mouthful there. Ophiu actually refers to snake-like. So Ophiuroidea, they arms kind of look like little snakes, so that's where the name comes from. But they actually are quite mobile. They move their arms much more quickly, and by scuffling them against the seafloor, they move rather rapidly, and while they do have tube feet, they don't use them so much for movement like the sea stars, their cousins, do. So let's move on to group number 3, the class Echinoidea. Echinoids, echino again refers to spiny, so echinoids means bearing spines, having spines on them. And again, these include the urchins and the sand dollars, and they look very spiny. This is our local Southern California urchin, red urchin, very common here. And this blue one that you see is actually common in Hawaii. So how do you see this pentaradial symmetry here? It's really difficult. In fact, you have to remove the spines to see it really well. But when you do that, here's what a dead urchin looks like. Each one of these rays that you see coming down here represents one of the pentaradial rays. So in a circle, you can see it has 1, 2, 3 that are kind of visible, and then 4 on this side, and then 1 in the back that you can't quite see. So that's where you get the 5-sided symmetry. And in the case of these organisms, the ossicles that we mentioned, those small little pieces of calcium carbonate that make their internal skeleton, their endoskeleton, they're all fused in the echinoids into almost like a 3D jigsaw puzzle. So it's really unique. It gives the animal some rigidity to it, and they're able to protect themselves with those incredible spines. This is what the inside of a sea urchin looks like. There's not a whole lot in there. It's mostly just reproductive structures and digestive structures. And in fact, if you've ever eaten uni, if you guys have ever heard of uni, it's normally served in a sushi restaurant. It's what you're eating are sea urchins. But when you look inside here, you're like, wait a minute, I don't see any meat per se. So what is it that I'm actually eating? Well, uni is sea urchin roe. It's reproductive structure. It's gonads. That's what you're eating. Other than that, though, other than this sea urchin roe, which is depicted here in green, there are the tube feet that run the length of the radial canals and the digestive structure in there. Now, at the base of the mouth of this organism, the mouth is on the underside here. The mouth actually has 5 teeth. They look just like this. And those teeth are incredibly strong. Now, they're not for biting. What they are is for scraping. They use these very strong calcium carbonate teeth to scrape the rocks, and these guys eat algae. So as impressive as those teeth are, they're really just using them to be a vegetarian, of all things. This is what one of those feeding structures looks like when you remove it from the organism, and it has a really unusual name. They actually refer to them as Aristotle's lantern. Why is that? Well, Aristotle, go back to ancient times, Aristotle was the person who actually described this. Lantern because, well, back then, this kind of had a shape of the lanterns that were used back then for light. So this is what it looks like inside the organism, and it's innervated with all kinds of really strong muscles to push and pull on the Aristotle's lantern so that this organism can scrape the algae. Second to last group, the class Holothuroidea. Holothuroidea is also a very long name, certainly. The way that I remember it is holothuroid or holo. That's kind of the sound you make when you are throwing up. Why is that important? Because it turns out these organisms have a really strange way of evading predators. Jumping all the way to the bottom, this word here, evisceration, means to essentially remove the guts of an organism. Well, they do it on their own. If you take a a sea cucumber and you poke and you prod it and you kind of irritate it enough, they feel threatened. What they do is they actually throw up their entire intestinal tract and other organs as well, all comes out of their mouth, and a passing predator, like a fish, for example, might be content to eat what they've thrown up. Well, here's where it gets really strange. These animals are actually able to regrow their internal organs. And so that's amazing. If you were a medical researcher, of course you would want to know how these animals are able to regrow organs, because that's something that we would like to know how to do, right? Well, these are a perfect model specimen for studying that. So evisceration, only the sea cucumbers do this. And again, holothuroidea, that's the sound that I kind of hear. It sounds almost like these organisms are throwing up. So there you go. You will never forget it from this point forward. Now, they also have ambulacral grooves running down the length of these organisms, but because they spend so much of their time essentially laying on their side, the ambulacral groove is really just developed only on one side. And the ossicles that are present in this organism are much more reduced. And so they're microscopic. You can really only see them using high magnification. Now, they do have tentacles on one end and also underneath. And these are what they use to essentially walk along the bottom. And the tentacles that are around their mouth, well, they're using those for feeding. Now, the last group are the crinoids, class Crinoidea. Crino actually refers to time. And that essentially is a reference to the fact that these are very ancient animals. Of all of the echinoderms, these are the ones that we find in the fossil record going back to 400 million years ago. And they come in two main varieties. They come in this stalked variety here. Most of the stalked varieties are deep sea dwelling crinoids, and they're actually quite beautiful. This one here is being photographed from a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV that had been driven to the bottom of the ocean to photograph them. I believe this picture is from the Monterey Bay area. And the other variety are the crowned crinoids. This particular crowned crinoid I photographed in the Great Barrier Reef. Despite the fact that they have all of these arms that stick up in both of these varieties of crinoids, they still do have pentaradial symmetry. If you look at them from the top of the organism, you will find 5 rays. It's just that each of the rays then splits into 2, and then each of those rays can further split into 2, giving the appearance of having multiple arms. But actually, these are just multiples of 5. Of all of the echinoderms out there, again, just pointing out, they are the most ancestral of them. Again, you've got this stalked variety on the left and the crowned variety on the right. And the variety on the right actually has these little legs that stick out and hold on to structures, and they actually walk themselves out to the end of promontories like this so that they can feed in the current by filter feeding. These little leg-like structures are referred to as cirri. That ends our treatment of the echinoderms, and this finishes out our entire treatment of the invertebrates, actually. So I'll see you all in class.